right, so here we go. That's the bass rack that I'm talking about. And it's pretty complex. It's made up of other racks I made. So I'm going to go through it step by step, and then we're going to make it from scratch, maybe. Alright, so here's the rack. And everything is in one rack. So what's cool about this is I can whip out the rack on any track. It's really easy. But there's a ton of stuff going on that I often will do on separate channels, right? So there's all kinds of mid-bass sub-separation going on. I'm going to talk about my theory behind this. So I guess before we get to that part, I'm going to give a little preemptive groundwork for anyone who isn't familiar with multiband processing and multiband splitting. So if I get a synth out and we get a square wave, right, and this is going to be kind of the old school approach. So if we had a square wave, right? You can get a filter. We'll use the Pro Q. And you can see we can filter the filter, or we can filter the square wave. But if we want to make a bass out of this, right, and we want to like throw some distortion, I'll get a distortion that most people have. How about Saturator? Ableton Saturator. And then maybe we want to add some stereo to this, right? So we could go for like chorus. So if we want to keep going with this concept and we start, you know, duplicating these, and you know, we can start getting cool sounds out of this. We can change to some different distortion modes. Drop it down an octave. So we can start getting some cool sounds, but let's take this EQ and put one at the end of this chain, right? And we can look at this. It still has a pretty decent sub on it, right? Let's boost that up with the EQ. Right, so it still has a decent sub. Remember, from the source, we're doing mono. What if we put on the unison? We get some LFO to something like the wave shape, so maybe the pulse width here. Do a bipolar. And then we also get some sort of LFO to the volume, like an envelope to the volume, I should say. So we got stereo, we got more stereo, we got a lot of stuff moving now. Let's look at the EQ again. So look at that. See how the sub is starting to be lost and there's all kinds of weird super low pitched noise accumulating in the EQ? So you can see that by creating this cool bass, we're also destroying our sub. So the next move a lot of people would take, this is the traditional approach, is you would high pass that, and then you would take that high pass layer and group it with all the distortion and all the stereo stuff. And then you would also go and get that EQ and you would duplicate it onto a new chain. And that would be called sub. And the top one would become highs. And then on this duplicated EQ, you want to turn this into a low pass. And then you have just the sub. This one maybe we'll use as a high pass and also try to EQ out some of that super low pitched noise that's happening. And let's see if we can try to force a better sub onto this sound just with parallel cutting. So now I'm just going to work on the sub itself and maybe turn the highs down slightly just so I can hear the sub a little better. Right, so that's still, it's weak, you know, the sub's getting ruined by that stereo detuned double square wave with the pulse width. So really at this point, I'm going to talk about instrument racks, because instrument racks will allow you to, on a single chain, get multiple synths into one voice. So what I did was group the phase plant that's doing our square wave top bass, I'll call it top. And then let's get another phase plant. And we can create another oscillator. Let's do the sine wave. And now both of these will receive the same MIDI. And we can have two things. Right, but if we're cutting all the sub out of this highs layer here that's doing all the heavy lifting, we can do something here where we can just delete this old sub channel. That's the old school way of doing it. And instead we could put it just on that top channel. So let's do that first. And now the sub's going to be coming out clean. If I get another EQ, we can see we've got a really solid, clean sine wave, and we can add modulation to this. So for instance, we could do a forward pitch envelope on the sound. I'm going to put it on 1 instead of poly. We could turn it up maybe. So at this point you can also, since we have access to additive synths, if you don't have phase plant, you can do this with operator, is let's take a look at these low mids. So you have some interesting stuff happening in the low mids because of the Reese. We could try to also add in another sub-oscillator. So let's do a second sub-oscillator, but let's pitch this up with the harmonic to the third harmonic, and that's going to be a slightly less than 19 semitones of equal temperament above the pitch of this subnote, so it'll be easy to see on the graph. I'm going to turn it down more, but I want you to see it on the graph first. So it's that fifth sounding harmonic right there. So you can give as much as you want of that. I like to sometimes give it a bit of a volume envelope of its own so that it kind of starts to sound more like a drum. So you have that extra little punch of high. Also, we could give a volume envelope, so it's more similar to this top bass. Let's check out our EQ. In there, that third harmonic is present. Let's get it even more present. Let's kind of balance it out with the other sound. So. So I'm going to give it another little volume envelope that's a bit longer. So I'll duplicate that one. And let's make this one a bit longer and put it on the volume of that top sub oscillator. Right, so that gives the sub some interesting movement. If we want to listen to the sub alone, here it is. And you can look at it on the graph here. So having a separate envelope for that top sub can help get some really interesting like organicness into your subs. And you don't have to stop there. You know, you could turn on another oscillator and have a whole series of these top oscillators and make an additive bass that way with just sine waves. So let's listen to the whole thing again. So the problem with this is the sub sounds like a separate sub, right? So there is the method of intermodulation distortion where you can distort the top with the sub. So for that, what we're going to want to do is take this high pass and we're going to put it before this whole processing rack. And then this whole processing rack that has all the distortion and stereo stuff, we can drag that now outside of the instrument rack. And then if we group that rack with the instrument rack, it'll make a new chain for the instrument. Then it'll split off into top synth and bottom synth, and then it'll mix back together and both the sub and the top will hit this distortion chain, right? But if you remember before, we're going to run into the same problem of over time our sub's going to weaken. So that new sub, it sounds like it's there. We can change the level of the top to the sub. So I'll turn the top all the way down and bring it back in. Let's turn both of them all the way down and then start bringing the sub in first. So that's the intermodulation distortion sound right there. Let's look at it on the final EQ. All right, so you see that flat line across the mids? Let's try dipping some of that out. Okay, so we have static EQs. Keep in mind, with the new rack that I'm about to build, after I do this explanation, we're going to be able to avoid some of this stuff using key track filtering. Okay, and we're going to do it, I think, with a paid plugin, but there's a free alternative if you don't have that plugin. You can do this with all Ableton stuff, I'm pretty sure. The key tracking might be the hardest part in Ableton, because for some reason the key tracking on the filter is really super limited. I don't know why they did that. There should be a MIDI input on it, like on Corpus or something like that. Okay, so I'm just going to render this out because I think it's a kind of a cool sound. and it came out pretty quiet. But if we look at it, it has a pretty clean sine wave in there. There's some spikes here from the stuff that we could take off with a limiter. Soothe is pretty good at dealing with stuff like that too, or Spiff. Check it out, Spiff on a bass. Let's put it before the Pro L, and we're gonna put it on cut. And then since we only need to deal with the highs at the beginning, I can modulate the cut depth down after that little spike. A lot with that. So now if I freeze and flatten this, this is just a little side note for anyone who's making sample packs, these kind of little things. I don't usually do this during the track writing process. Alright, so now let's take a look at this new rack. It's based on this intermodulation distortion technique, but you don't have to use that. I've just been doing streams on this technique lately. It's a technique that I first learned about on EPROM's Twitch stream, and then later on saw a really interesting take using groups that Zeke Beats taught. EPROM was using multiple channels, multiple tracks. Zeke was using groups, clipping on groups and stuff. I'm doing, with this rack in particular, I wanted it to be able to function like those results, but on a single MIDI channel so that it's playable, right? So that was the goal. So if we get this out, we can take a look. All right, so it sounds like this out of the box. So the final gain, the final top gain, and the final sub gain right here, these are these two knobs. So I have independent control of the sub and the top. I also have a length knob, and that length knob is tied to both the sub patch and the top patch so that I can easily shorten or lengthen my overall sound. And if I go and duplicate that top bass, it'll keep that mapping. So I like to have that set up first. And the workflow with this bass is you can basically start to duplicate these chains and work with more and more patches inside a single MIDI track. You could have 9 or 10 different versions of a bass going on and just go between them with the chain selector, while using one sub patch. And the benefit of that is that at any later point, you can just solo this sub and just sample it out and have a sub stem if that's what you want. So a lot of the crazy noise on top is being caused by reverb in here in the top bass. So if I mute that reverb, it sounds like this. If I open this top bass rack, this has more MIDI channels in here. This is where the phase plant is. This is where a noise layer is. And this is just a sample of a crash that loops. So that's that little high noise that comes in at the end. Because it pops in when the sub goes out because of the intermodulation distortion. If I loop a different part, it'll sound different. Crossfade. Could give it more of a release like this. Okay, so we can mute the noise layer and just mess with this phase plant right here. That's what you're hearing here. And the balance between the sub and the top bass is set in this rack. So we want to go to the end of the rack. I'm going to close the rack and see this utility right here. This is the volume of the top bass going into a very special rack I built called, So the sub is the phase plant, just to refresh. And then in parallel, we have a top bass chain. That top bass chain has a top bass rack. That rack can contain as many top bass elements as you would like, including the MIDI send, which is how I'm doing key tracking. So all that's being accomplished in this top bass rack. Then we can take that whole top bass and boost the gain if we want, boosting by 8 here, into this routing hacker. All right. This routing hacker is using the sidechain listening button routing hack that I learned from Ilgates. Big shout out to Ilgates for this technique. It's genius, and there's so many cool things you can do with it. What I'm doing with this here is I'm listening to the channel that the rack is on, and then I'm going to listen to specifically the pre-FX sub chain within the Intermodulation Distortion effects rack. That's going to be this chain that has this very simple phase plant sub. Well, not very simple, but phase plant sub. Okay, so the phase plant sub, that's going right into this end of chain rack. And that end of chain rack is going to be a utility, a clean clipper, another utility, and then the last one is a little bit of a colorful clipper. And this is not being clipped very hard at all, but it is being modulated slightly. And this is just giving it that final coat of grit and fuzz. Then at the end we have a final EQ. This is like the master EQ for the sound, and I'm doing some compression with this EQ. Upwards compression on the sub ever so slightly. That's going to keep the sub a little bit louder for a little bit longer. Also doing a little bit of a dip in the mids, and then downwards compression on the highs here with the EQ. If you don't like that fluttering, you can do less, like this. So yeah, what that means is there's gentle EQing on the sub, gentle clipping on the sub, but there's no EQing that's going to mess with the sub's phase in any major way, right? So this is a clean sub. This sub doesn't have to have me doing stuff like this to it, which is going to start smearing it, give it pre-range, weird things. might start to happen with the sub. So that's cool. We get to avoid that. And to inception this sub into our top bass rack, because we need that nice clean sub to get this nice clean intermodulation distortion bass sound, I'm using this routing hacker. So we have the routing hacker. The gate is sidechained to the sub chain inside the rack. And then I clicked this little blue headphone. This is very important. If you don't click the blue headphone, it's not going to work. The blue headphone is listening to the sound that you're sidechaining to instead of the sound going through the gate. So what this does is it mutes the old sound that's going through the gate and inputs whatever sidechain signal you have coming in from a different part of Ableton. This is cross-chain. This is how you get stuff, how you can get stuff into weird places. Think of it as like a modular synth. You're just patching it into this. All right. And then we have a parallel dry chain, and that's going to let the top bass signal through. Okay. The one thing we might want to do to the dry signal, actually, come to think of it, is high pass it before it goes into the routing hacker. So let's do that. Let's try high passing it before it goes and mixes with the sub. I forgot to do that. All right, so the next thing after the routing hacker is gain. Okay, so I'm boosting the gain of the dry by 35 dB. I'm also boosting the gain of the sub, which is called external input, into 35 dB of gain boost into this decapitator. So to sculpt the character to the sound, we want to tweak these two gains. Let's dial them back. Let's do 13 dB and a little bit less. And then we also, to tweak the character, we want to go into our top bass patch and tweak that. Right, so we can tweak our top bass. Little bit of a cool FM sound there. And this is also where we can enable our stereo stuff. Chorus, delay, reverb, whatever. And then tweaking the gain again. Alright, so I guess we could maybe try some different stereo effects. Instead of reverb, let's try the comb filter. So we can get our comb filter, put it on stereo. That sounds crazy. Let's try sine waves. So the reason why it's ducking in and out is because I have this funky LFO shape on the subs volume. So we could try a different shape on the subs volume. You know, you can do all kinds of cool. Alright, so you're probably wondering why it's getting filtered and where that filter is. So let's keep going. So to recap, we got our top bass and we have our noise sample. We could try turning that back on. You can see that there's utilities everywhere in this patch too. Alright, so super gnarly. That's with that crash in there. Alright, so we have the routing hacker. I think I explained that. That's a parallel rack. You're getting the sub in cleanly into the top bass chain, inception mode. And the dry signals coming through. You're boosting those independently. And then we have another gain here after the rack. So if I close the rack, we have another gain, and that's going to be our final input gain before we hit another utility that's going to be our actual final input gain. Two utilities into the clipper that's doing all the work, which is Decapitator in this case. So we could try different algorithms there. Something that's also sometimes useful is an EQ before the clipping on the top bass. that can be useful, or after the clipper too. And then sometimes EQ could be useful too, or I mean OTT, or compression. So if I get like a Pro MB out and put that after the decapitator, we start to compress these uppers. This can get out of hand if you don't get the right release times. See, that's a little better. Right, so we have the inception sub and the top bass going into some clipping that's gonna do the intermodulation distortion work. Then we have a key track filter after that. All right, so if I open this up, let's make it extra large. This is our filter track. We could change the resonance. Sub has a weird gnarly pitch envelope on it, so I'm just going to change that. Make it a bit more sudden. So a lot of cool things become possible now that we have this on one MIDI channel, and especially in one rack. For one, we can macro things up, like the length. We could change the length right now. We can see that once we've key track filtered the top bass, right here at the end, after the clipping, I have one final EQ on the top bass. That's just going to kind of control, because the other key track filter wasn't really cutting out all the sub as much, but it still keeps that nice resonant peak tracking along with. And I believe it will glide along too. So it follows the glide. If we give this a bit of glide time, this is another thing we could macro up. And you can see that I already have the glide times macroed up. So we could macro that to the Ableton rack by going to configure and tweaking it, and then mapping the glide time to a macro. And then we want to map that macro to another macro, so that we can also go into the sub and tweak its, configure its glide time and map that to the same glide knob, so that we can control both the glide times simultaneously. Keep the two basses functioning as one. And then we can tweak our final balance here, so maybe turn the top slightly down. turn our noise layer down and hear just the upper phase plant. This can be cool pitched up too. Let's pitch it way up. Right, so now that it's one instrument, I can play it on one keyboard easily. I can use MPE if I want. There's all kinds of cool things that we can do by functioning in this rack form, and you really just got to get your mind around the tree system, right? So it's left to right. So as you go from left to right, you can grow more and more branches. And then depending on where you choose the end of each little rack, and you can see that because it's curved, it's got this little bookend that doesn't have a power button. So that's, that's the end of that rack. You can close each rack and it becomes real nice and compact, right? So if we get over here, you can read intermodulation. So we know that's the main rack. And then we could even group this stuff at the end and call this bus process group or final process, right? So that's our final process, and like I said, it's a utility to control the gain going into a standard clip. Highly recommend this clipper, it's very clean. And then I have another utility and then rift, and this could be any distortion at the end. You may not even need extra distortion at the end. That's just what I wanted, was that little bit of coloring on the entire signal, including the sub. But rift's not doing any stereo information really. It's mostly just mono, simple, not overly aggressive final clip. And then, we got the EQ. You could even put a compressor if you wanted. Let's try that. So I'll show you the analog obsessions. The Brit presser. The Brit presser is a SSL kind of style compressor. It's like a master bus, and this is free on Patreon. Analog Obsession. So we can get like a lot of punch if we slow down the attack time. Or if we do a short attack time, we can just get a little plucky thing at the beginning. This is this master limiter too. So this is going to be the threshold right here. Oh, actually, yeah, this is the threshold, and then there's a limiter as well. See, now you can see the compression. If we lengthen the recovery time, it'll keep it quieter for longer before it comes back in. And it also has these auto settings. Let's try something like 800. And then let's try like less, like a 1 to 5. So the gain is really being turned down at the beginning of that sound and then swelling back in. So we could maybe reduce the amount even more by upping the threshold. We could try some different things for this top bass. So let's try some other things. Instead of a simple thing, let's go for a wavetable. And maybe modulate that. Let's give it more gain. We can now go back and tweak the volume of our Intermodulation Distortion rack, which is the next in the chain. So that's going to be the dry gain. External in. We have to double click. Remember to double click if you close a chain, because then you might be tweaking the wrong knob. I think there's some weird envelope on the top bass that I want to change. Yeah, this. Let's give it more release. Space is artificial. It'll give it more of a tail. We can try weird spectral wavetables. That sounds cool. Let's try the stereo. When you're doing higher pitched versus lower pitched top basses, often you have to like retweak the gain of that dry signal. So since I pitched it back down, I'll turn it up a bit more. You can also highlight areas with a filter to boost into the clipping or cut the highs to tune it back. So you can get these like screaming peaks into the clipper. So that's having like the sub be shorter than the attack, or I mean the sub has a shorter release than the top bass does. let's try the opposite. Let's go and just really shorten up this release. And let's shorten up the release of the sub as well. And we still need to shorten up that like hat a little bit on the top bass. So let's get that release going. Right? So it's really easy to morph this bass once you kind of get a hang of it. And yeah, if you like one sound, like you like that one, right, you could say, oh, well, I would like more. So let's duplicate this top. And then check it out. If we go into the chain, we can elongate our MIDI send all the way. We want that all the time. Noise all the way. Maybe we want that all the time. But then what if we want two different top basses that you can switch between? Well, we would do this and then this. And we could even have a space where they blend between each other by using these top littler white lines. And then if we map this to macro 3, it'll be the chain selector. And we can now move this. And maybe this new one we can tweak now, and we won't even hear the old one. So let's try a different wavetable. We could try different convolution. We could try pitching it up. So there's a cool one, and now check it out, we can switch between. Then the mix of both. Pretty cool. So you can go ham with that. You can have as many little top basses as you want. I'll actually resave this now as multi-top. So we have multi-tops with one sub. And you can do this without the clipping if you want a cleaner sound. And in that case, you won't have to probably do this routing hacker, right? But this same thing applies, like I showed you here. If you want to have a separate sub and a top, you can do this sort of thing. And you can also do the key tracking with the external instrument. And just to touch on that real quick before I wrap it up, you can see in this top bass chain, we have a MIDI send chain, and that's gonna be sending the MIDI that comes into the top bass to the chain that it's on, and then to the individual plugin, which would be the Volcano. Okay, and then that will make it so that the Volcano can track around. This is cool because you could highlight a higher harmonic. See, that's hitting kind of the high fifth. right? So that's pretty fun. It doesn't look like it's gliding. There's no glide time, so that's something to be aware of with the key track filtering. There's no way to put glide time on the key track. There should be, but there's not. And then I should note that this sub has a noise layer on it. Oh, actually it doesn't. Okay, the noise layer is just that symbol in this patch. All right, so I hope that inspires you to make some of these things. Comment down below if you like what you saw. If you have any ideas, comment. Say what's up. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'm Sephiros. If you like these sounds, I'm going to be putting a bunch of cool intermodulation basses up this month for the sample pack on my Patreon. That's going to be sick. And just to leave you with another idea, you can do this kind of processing with snares, kicks, leads, pads. You can do this kind of processing with using reverb, parallel reverbs, parallel spectral things. There's so many things you can do with this. This is really just the basic rack. And, the big plus of it is that since it's all contained in one rack, you can save it and then pull it up whenever you want. And you can use this rack, like you can have just one rack in your project and just render out samples, keep changing it, render out more samples, keep changing it, render out more samples, keep changing it. Or you can have just one or two of them, but you're able to morph the bass and get so many different variations within the bass that you may only need one or two of these patches to write a whole entire song. So you could have one of these and then another one and then a third one that's outside of the arrangement that you just use as like a generator of other cool sounds. So you could like spend a little time automating your main basses, go over to that other mega patch, morph it around a bit, spit out some cool sounds, go back in, use those sounds as either like layers or little fill moments between that main patch that you're evolving. And actually, before I leave, let's go back to this beat I was working on, and you can see how I'm automating this patch. So I am automating this patch slightly to change over time. So it's not changing that much over time, but you can see I'm just modulating the length and the dry gain. The dry gain's going up, so you're getting a little bit more of that top bass as the timeline progresses, So that's why it's kind of more percussive in the first part and more sustained in the second part. Let's put our new patch right there. the same melody. Since these have tails, it's good to have a final gain on the channel itself to just be able to easily automate mutes. It's always a good thing. I have that on almost every single channel. So we can automate these to not get in the way of each other. I wonder if I reverse these. Oops. I wonder if I reverse these. Let's bring this one in again here and then mute the other one. And then you see here we could automate that. You could automate this chain selector. So let's start here on the first one and then go to here on the first one, or on the second one. Alright, sick. Oh, nice. Definitely try out Morph EQ. Definitely Morph EQ is fun. Alrighty. Yeah, thanks for watching. If you didn't see the first part of the stream, this should be up on YouTube pretty soon, so you can peep it there. And yeah, till next time, I'm Sephiroth. Big up, big up, big up. Peace.